Shashi, thank you for joining us so late in the evening today. We really appreciate you making the time to join us and address some of our questions and many more from the audience. So I'd request the audience to also post in your questions as we go live. Shashi, as I get started, right, you talk a lot about building companies or differentiating good versus great. Tell us a little bit about what is the philosophy of good versus great, and how have you imbibed that in the HighRadius journey and your learnings or failures and how you've learned from those failures. So just love to get your insights.
Yeah, so first, Sangeeta, can you actually see my video? Like, I'm not able to see you.
Yes,
So,
I can see your video. I can hear you well.
okay, I cannot see anything, so I can keep going, but I don't know if you
Yes.
need to do
As long as
anything.
you hear us, I think it should be okay.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome. Yeah, so I think it's an abstract uh, comparison of good versus great. So at HighRadius, we use a term called dot one, which is one in a thousand, where we think you need to be the best of the best of what you do. Because ultimately, if you really want to be great, then everything you do, from every individual employee, from product, sales, and all the processes, have to be really high class. So I know it's still high level, but what do you need to do to make it best in class, where you don't settle for mediocre stuff and challenge yourself to be the best at everything you do?
So tell us a little bit about, you started the company in 2006. You became a unicorn in 2020. The initial few years you chose to be a bootstrapped company. Tell us a little bit about how you phased out the growth of the company and your learnings that may be relevant for many other product entrepreneurs that are attending this session.
Yeah, I mean, I guess lots of failures and a lot of challenges. But I guess maybe from an entrepreneur standpoint, I would say the number one learning or the advice that I would give is, especially for Indian entrepreneurs who mostly come from technical background, is you need to be the number one sales rep for your company. So this was my learning. I did a startup before this. It was okay. And then I realized that I was too techy. I was too much focused on products, which is fine. But I think in hindsight, then before I started HighRadius, I actually took a year off and read every sales book and marketing book on Amazon.com. I went and bought the top 50 books and read them. And then the entire year, I just stayed home studying, just saying that I need to pivot from being a techie product entrepreneur to, I don't think I can just outsource sales to somebody else. I need to figure it out myself. So that's my number one learning and advice for any entrepreneur who's listening to this. You'll probably figure out the product, you can recruit the right talent, but either you or one of your co-founding partners have to figure out sales.
No, that's very interesting. So taking a complete year off just to figure out what sales means. I haven't heard too many other technology product entrepreneurs doing that. And I think that is just so important, because ultimately, like we heard even in the last session, right, it is about understanding the voice of the customer rather than trying to build the most perfect product, right? I think that's often an issue we see a lot with very early stage entrepreneurs. So Shashi, tell us a little bit about the funding strategy. You chose a slightly different approach from what you see today, and maybe the market itself has changed. But
Yeah.
what was your thinking as you were thinking about, should I raise funding or should I be profitable from day one, or what is the investment I need to make, because product companies do require deeper investment in R&D, go to market, hiring the right team, etc.
Yeah, so I'll give the HighRadius perspective, and then I think every entrepreneur has to decide what's best for them. So for us, I think it was very clear from day one that we're going to build a software company, for a long-lasting software company that outlasts us. So if you just, I'll share some stats. The average lifespan of a tech company is 6.5 years. Of course, some might exit successfully, some might go out of business. The average lifespan of a, believe it or not, a Fortune 1000 company is actually 46 years. So to me, that was not inspiring. And I think tech companies raise too much money too early and build a startup inefficiently. And then every investor has a time frame. I'm sure you know that it's an 8-year time frame. They invest the first 4 years and they harvest the next 4 years. So I think if you bring in too many investors too early, you need to think from an investor perspective. You also need to give them the exit. So that was not an option for me. I felt like I want to build a business for the longest term that will outlast me. But that also brings a lot of challenges and difficulties. I would not recommend that for every entrepreneur. You need to carefully think through what is your funding strategy, and that's a function of what you want for yourself and what you want this business to be on the long run.
So the last funding round that you took, which got you the unicorn status. What was your big driver for that? What was the pivot moment you were thinking when you agreed to do that funding round, or you pitched for that funding round?
Yeah, so we did our Series A in actually 2017, November. I would say our Series A was almost this like a Series C or a Series D. One of our competitors had already raised 80 million, and we knew that we had the better products, but we were not necessarily getting the category leader recognition. And it's I think of it as like a game, a poker game, where you stay in the game long enough, but at some point your chips need to be big enough too, right? You can play a good game, but if you have very few chips compared to the scale of the other company. So the strategy of doing a Series A was to really establish ourselves as the category leader, which literally happened in a year and a half. So that was the main reason. It was a bit risky. We could have continued to bootstrap, but we would have taken some risk of not becoming number one.
Interesting. And that's really my follow-up question on, building a category leader in a very, very niche segment, right? So you talk about reimagining the CFO office and, helping them become more efficient in what they do. Uh, it's not an easy space for getting the CFOs to be convinced on using products that they may not be as familiar with. So as a part of your sales GTM strategy, how did you do that? And of course the first question is, how do you decide the right niche to play in versus a horizontal play where more companies may tend to go because the opportunity set is much wider, right?
Yeah, so maybe this is again an opinion. So I'm
Right,
a bit
opinions are welcome. So
contrarian. I think a bit of a contrarian. So I'm not a big fan of hype and chasing hype. I feel like the moment you chase hype, it's too late, and hype is not going to take you too far. So my belief system is, in general, you need to go after a market that's at least $1 billion of total addressable market. So think about the way you would do the math is, if you think about the total number of companies that have a genuine need for your software, and you've multiplied that by the average deal size, is at $1 billion of opportunity, and you can probably get to 10% of that. To build a real company, you need to get to about 100 million ARR. Now, whether you do it in the office of the CFO, supply chain management, or any space, I don't think it matters. In my view, I think it is the how is the market being served. So if you think about any space, you have to look at, is it big enough, which is the $1 billion of total addressable market. What are the current providers, and what you offer? Is it going to fundamentally change how that market is being served? So I do think that every category will get reinvented every 7-10 years. The way the restaurants will operate 10 years from now will be different. And so I think, as an entrepreneur, if you do the mindset of, I'm going to fundamentally change this particular process, the way it's operating, into a future state that makes logical sense for society at large, and I'll be the one and the team together to get there. There is opportunity everywhere. So I think this whole concept of one space is hard, the other is not hard. That would be like timing the stock market. If you think about it as a long term, every category, it's not like the world is going to end with, like, as an example, Uber. There'll be somebody else who will disrupt Uber, right? Or restaurants, right? So I think some entrepreneur will figure out a much better way to solve the same problem that will get acceptance from the customers at large.
So how do you prevent that happening to what you're building up, right? How do you do it yourself? Because like you said, it will have a lead time of 7-8 years, but it is likely to happen. So how do you, as a business or as a leader, disrupt yourself?
Very good. It's difficult as the business companies grows from, we are at 3,000 employees, from 10 employees. It's easy to influence. I think the culture is very important. I know that culture is a buzzword and kind of like an overstated, but you have to challenge yourself and not settle for what you have and get complacent. So you need to. So what? How the way we do it with our product management team is, I know you are here today. Where do you think the market will be 7 years from now? You have to define that. So we don't take up product features for the sake of taking it up. It has to move us. So over the years, actually, we actually got into AI before AI. At that time, it was statistics, so we would not claim it. And then we're launching a platform called autonomous software. Nobody talks about it, so we are big believers in it. So we are making those bets into the future, and you have to invest a reasonable amount of money in R&D. and you'll have your share of failures, but you have to course correct.
Yeah, I think that's just so important to do. And you're right, just the push for the right culture, but also the right practices is very, very important as the organization grows. So, the last session we heard a lot about, as a young company, you can tend to make a lot of mistakes. And, today, if you were to do it all over again, how would you think about high radius if you were building it in today's high growth, high hype environment, to use your words?
Yeah. Wow. So if you think about the number of mistakes, there'll be like millions of mistakes. So what would I change? I just think I always feel like we are just taking more time than we should take for everything in hindsight. Uh, if I had to go back in time and think about changing, I would probably focus a lot more on the talent from day one who gets into the door versus compromising. I'm not saying we have done that as a at large, but if you think about becoming a really bigger software company, the original set of employees become big champions and they need to grow and retool themselves. Uh, at that time, of course, we were a startup, so we would probably literally take anyone who would work for us because beggars cannot be choosers. But even then, I would probably be more thoughtful on every individual. I used to interview up to like um, 500 employees every employee, and then after that every manager. Even today I interview every director and above. So that concept is there, but I would say like maybe a lot more rigor from day one on the quality of talent that gets into the door.
So, and talent is one of the, I think, the most biggest challenge that is across companies, across industries, startups, large companies. Everybody is struggling with talent over the last 6, 9 months. So, as a relatively younger company, Shashi, how are you thinking about your talent strategy in this hyper competitive market, right? Like, one of the speakers before this spoke about, if you keep buying talent at higher and higher costs, you're building an unsustainable market, right? And that does not help the ecosystem at all. So for a
Yeah.
company like HighRadius, how are you thinking about attracting the best talent, and yet may not be paying the best salaries, right?
Yeah. So first of all, we are not big believers in overpaying. So here's kind of what I think about, right? I think about business is like a sport. I mean, if you just do an analogy of an IPL team in India, there is a salary cap, right?
Yes.
And the difference between sports like a cricket or IPL and business is in IPL there are 11 starting players. So given that salary cap, you have to optimize from player 1 to player 11 how much to spend to maximize the output. When I think about business, the concept is still the same. There is a general macro level salary cap, right? If you're going to generate so much revenue, there'll be so much expense, that kind of stuff. Then the other X factor is there is no limit on the number of people. So if you have to think about recruiting from young gen out of college talent to very experienced, and how do you balance that out? So what we do is we are not generally big on like overpaying. We don't go after talent who will only join just for money. Of course, everybody needs to get paid fair market value of their salary, but we don't force the issue by overpaying to win a short term game, because I think you end up building a rich company, rich kid culture with when the markets change and the funding dries up or the valuations change. I don't think you can do a surgery of a company and the culture and just automatically do layoffs or reduce salary. So I think you have to be very careful when you think about long term, and you have to go with that instinct of what is the reasonable salary for this role. And then we do make bets on people who are not necessarily exactly the same experience. So I call it like we don't recruit as reason by analogy. So if it is product management, we make bets on people who are like might not necessarily be product management experience, but we think that we have the brain power and the learning and the curiosity. So we tend to be creative where we are not trying to do the exact same role with the exact same experience, because how do you scale that, right? Because there is a supply demand gap in the market because every startup is getting funded.
And I think that's just the right approach to take. Shashi, so a question: when we go and talk to a lot of the startups that work with NASSCOM through the product initiative we run, especially the deep tech initiatives, and you are building an AI first company, uh, their challenges are somewhat different from the consumer segment companies, right? So what would be your advice to somebody who is trying to solve a harder problem, is focusing on an AI first approach? How should they think about both the product life cycle as well as the whole go to market strategy for them?
Just to make sure you're asking for a software company and not a B2C startup,
Not a
right?
B2C player.
B2B.
Yes. Yeah.
I think anyone who's thinking AI first has to be just thoughtful that the hype waves kind of change. You should look at AI, but so here's kind of my basic principle when it comes to software. Are you creating value for the end customer? And the end customer is usually a chief department officer, right? A CFO. If you are an HR software, it's a chief people officer. If it is marketing software, it's a chief marketing officer. Their roles have not changed. These are basically department leaders that need to have some business outcomes. And then technology, whether they buy servers or AWS or HighRadius or something else, is just a cost center. So if you build a strong conviction that you're creating value for them, whatever value V1 you create, you will get a subset of that. And that is the best way to build a long term insurance and durability of your business. Now, are you doing that using AI or heuristics or analytics? It doesn't matter. AI does help on the hype wave and the marketing on the short term, but it's not going to help you on the long run if you're not creating value. So I would be careful in not focusing on just doing AI. AI is just a technology. How are you creating value in the problem you're solving for the customer? I think is more important.
No, so you're really saying that technology will help you, but it may open the door for you, but it's not going to give you the business unless you can show the real value to the customer, especially when you are in any business, not even a niche business, right? That's really your key message for entrepreneurs who are building some of these deep technology products and solutions. Think a customer first approach.
Absolutely, because if you think about how software is purchased, of course, if you're selling something for $50 or $100 per month, it's a discretionary purchase, right? That's like maybe going and buying tea. It's just making. But then if you're selling something more than like $30,000-$40,000 of ARR per annum, if you have to think about how companies buy. Every company has a budget committee, approval committee. They do actually ROI math, return on investment. They do what is called as internal rate of return calculation. Like it's like I know that, for example, Nexon Mobil, if you're selling to Exxon Mobil, no project that has less than 22% of IRR will ever get approved. So your buyers are ultimately doing the math on cost justifying your software purchase as an investment over 5 years, where they look at the total cost of ownership, subscription fees plus setup fees, and what return they're going to get. So the AI is not going to answer that. You still need to explain to them with a business case how it's going to create value. I'm not generalizing it for all software, but at large, 80% of the software gets bought through a value justification process and an ROI process in companies.
Yeah. Interesting analogy that you used, and I think should be very useful for the attendees for this event and beyond, because the session will be available through this platform for many other people who could not join us today. So Shashi, really my last question is, the theme of this conference is building world class from India, and you have a center in Hyderabad. You've obviously looked at what India can do and cannot do. What would be
Mhm.
your key inputs for India if we've got good success now? I think everybody recognizes Indian products can become global leaders. But if we had to really make this 10x, 100x, what would be your advice for the ecosystem, for the entrepreneurs, for the talent we have in India? Just love to get your perspectives.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So let's kind of, I was very intrigued by the term world class. So let's see if we can define that, right? I think the world class basically means you're building a product that is, let's say, number one in the world. If you're building a product that is a number one in the world, which means that it's a category leader. Now, actually, if you just think about pure stats, India has yet to build a lot of category leaders. We do have business models that we are cloning from Western business models, and we are replicating that in India. But do you know Sangeeta, any company that's a category leader in India? World global category leader. I'm just curious as a brand.
Yeah, number one, I don't think so.
Okay. And I think that's the problem. I think for that, I think it's a very hard game, because I think you need to have that mindset, and you need to have that pride that I am going to build the best product in the world, and I'm not going to settle for number two. And that's a very difficult journey. And it requires a certain type of rigor and depth, right? If you think about how products like Apple got built or Tesla gets built, right? I mean, it's very inspiring for me when I look at some of these entrepreneurs. But I think even for myself, it's a struggle because I kind of come from a chelta hai economy. The way I grew up in a middle class family and maybe like a single bedroom apartment and so forth. But we naturally in our DNA do not have the high quality mindset. There's nothing wrong with that because that's how we grew up, right? But I think we need to kind of fight that. So when I think about HighRadius, I say this to all of our employees and HighRadians that you have to change that mindset from the chelta high, and you have to bring that pride of the fine detail of the work in everything you do, whether you write a document, whether you write an email, the UI and the cleanliness of the UI to the architecture. And you should not just settle quickly because we are wired to settle the way we grew up, most of us being from middle class family. This is going to be hard. I don't think it's trivial, even though we are saying world class. We will probably take a slice of some popular categories out there because there is a lot of market demand, and we can build that from India. I kind of think of it as made in China, right? China is a number one manufacturing company, so India will be a number one, could become the number one software company. But will India ever build a category leader? It's going to take time. It'll be a fundamental mind shift, and it's not trivial.
Yeah. Very, very interesting insights. And I think the most important you highlighted is the mindset, right? Uh, Obviously, all the other parameters of attention to detail, quality, innovation, getting the customer fit right. Those are all very critical, but it all starts with getting the right mindset and making sure you have both the vision, aspiration, and the execution discipline to get it right. Thank you so much, Shashi, for this very, very insightful discussion. I'm sorry you could not see the video. We could see you well, so we've enjoyed this discussion every bit. We look forward to getting a little bit of more of your time for continuing to help build this vision on world class from India. Truly appreciate this. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks for having me.